This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel and the Palestinian Authority spar over who's at fault over the tragic death of a journalist during a counterterrorism raid. Plus, in the lion's den, former Israeli ambassador Danon tells CBN's Gordon Robertson what it was like defending the Jewish state in the United Nations. And the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, the growth of a worldwide movement praying for the peace of Jerusalem. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The Iranian nuclear deal remains on hold, apparently over one key sticking point. Still, the pressure is on to sign the agreement. But some Middle East experts say dark clouds forming in the region could lead to a nuclear storm. After months of negotiations, the U.S. and Iran are at a deadlock over removing Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps from the Foreign Terrorist Organization list.
The IRGC has American blood on its hands, and there's no good reason for the United States to even consider lifting this FTO designation.
Middle East expert Eli Konim says bipartisan support on Capitol Hill is building to keep that designation in place.
You're hearing from many, both Democrat and Republican members of Congress, who have voiced their concern to the Biden administration that there's no good reason to lift that FTO designation.
Even if that stipulation remains and the deal is signed, concern is growing that it will pave the way to nuclear proliferation in the Middle East.
The Saudis already have agreements with the Pakistanis. They funded the Pakistani nuclear project, and they are ready to procure nuclear weapons the moment this agreement is signed, and they understand that Iran is moving towards nuclear capability. So what we will see is proliferation of nuclear capabilities all over the Middle East.
Avivi also told CBN News the agreement would have global implications.
This is not talking about threat in the Middle East. This is a whole new globe. It's a whole new world. It's a threat for humanity. And therefore, I cannot understand why the European Union and this current US government is pushing towards enabling this vicious regime who calls America the big Satan and calls Israel the little Satan. Let them have nuclear capabilities.
As it stands, the nuclear agreement also promises sanctions relief that would release nearly $100 billion to the Iranian regime. Avivi and others believe the money would not only fund Iranian partners in the region, like Hezbollah and others, it could reach allies closer to the U.S., like Venezuela, which Avivi calls Iran's Cuba. Well, here in Israel, a major incident threatens even more clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinian terrorists. Israel is still investigating the death of a journalist killed during an operation to arrest terrorists. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl brings us that story.
Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was laid to rest in the Greek Catholic cemetery on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Church bells rang out as thousands of mourners gathered in Jerusalem's Old City and joined the funeral procession of the woman now hailed as a Palestinian hero and martyr. The hours-long live feed broadcast scathing commentary against Israel and showed Israeli police beating pallbearers. Earlier, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said the Palestinian Authority has rejected the idea of a joint investigation and refuses access to the basic findings of the autopsy.
I therefore reiterate my expectation of an open, transparent, and full cooperation of the findings, and I also expect the Palestinian Authority not to take any steps to disrupt the investigation or to contaminate the investigation process in a way that we will not be able to reach the truth.
At a memorial service in Ramallah, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave his reasons for not cooperating with any investigation into Shireen Abu Akleh's death.
We point out that we have refused and rejected the joint investigation with the Israeli authorities because they are the ones who committed the crime and because we do not trust them, and we will immediately go to the International Criminal Court to prosecute the criminals.
The IDF released a statement during the funeral saying there were two possibilities. First, hundreds of bullets were fired by Palestinian gunmen from a number of locations, making this a possible source of the gunfire that hit and killed her. The second possibility is that during the exchange of fire between the Palestinian gunmen and IDF soldiers, Ms. Abu Akleh, who was near the Palestinian gunman from behind, was hit by the soldiers' fire toward the Palestinian gunmen. Shireen was a well-known and well-respected Palestinian reporter for the Arabic-language Al Jazeera channel. She was also a U.S. citizen. Shireen and other journalists were covering an Israeli raid at the Jenin Palestinian refugee camp when she was shot in the head and died. Bennett's spokesperson noted that the Palestinian Forensic Medicine Institute had publicly stated that the results of the autopsy were inconclusive.
Without any concrete evidence, hasty accusations against Israel that are being made right now are misleading and irresponsible.
The incident comes against the backdrop of a surge in terror attacks over the last 2 months, where 19 Israelis have been murdered. Many of the terrorists have come from the area of Jenin, prompting numerous raids to arrest them. Also on the same day as the funeral, an Israeli soldier was killed in Jenin during an arrest operation on Friday.
In Jenin, historically, there is deep influence of Islamic Jihad, and they are getting money from Iran.
Pinchas Imbari from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs says the terror group has stepped in to help Hamas mobilize terrorism in the West Bank.
Because this is the agenda of Hamas. So they put plenty of resources to start terrorism from the West Bank.
Immediately following the fatal raid, the Palestinian Authority vowed to go to The Hague and call for an investigation. Inbari says the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas are using Shireen's death as a way back into the international limelight.
The PA must be relevant. The PA is not relevant anymore. Israel made peace with the Arab countries. They don't need the Palestinians anymore. The Arabs stopped to finance the PA. Only Israel is now financing the PA.
Israel is also concerned that the Palestinians could use the incident to incite more trouble. But Bennett says Israel will continue to operate to cut off the current wave of terrorism. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
The new White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre's promotion, makes her the first black woman and first LGBTQ person to hold a key post. While many are excited about President Biden's groundbreaking pick, not everyone supports it, including some in the pro-Israel community. CBN's Tara Mergener has more on why pro-Israel groups are concerned.
While receiving wide praise for the high-profile position, not everyone is embracing President Biden's pick. Former Ambassador David Friedman tweeting, amidst all the celebration of Biden's new press secretary checking multiple boxes in identity politics, the mainstream media forgot to mention that she hates Israel.
Karine Jean-Pierre has a track record of making anti-Israel statements. As an example, she's accused Israel of committing war crimes, quote unquote.
In 2019, as a spokesperson for MoveOn.org, Jean-Pierre wrote a scathing op-ed in Newsweek, endorsing the boycott of a historically bipartisan group, which advocates for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship.
She's also accused the America-Israel Political Action Committee, AIPAC, of indulging in racism and Islamophobia. One wonders whether she'll be capable of being objective.
Press secretaries have the power to shape presidential agenda and public perception. Jean-Pierre's supporters insist she'll use the power of her post wisely. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Coming up, in the Lion's Den, Ambassador Danny Danon tells what it was like defending the Jewish state at the United Nations. The epicenter of global anti-Israel sentiment is the United Nations in New York City. A new book explains why the UN spends more time condemning Israel than any other nation, and how one Israeli diplomat faced off against this anti-Semitic fury. It's followed by an interview by CBN's Gordon Robertson with the author. For 5 turbulent years, Danny Danon served as Israel's ambassador to the UN. While representing the Jewish state, he confronted anti-Zionism and defended Israel against charges of apartheid and racism. Danon also found allies in those diplomatic battles, like former U.S. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. his new book, In the Lion's Den, Israel and the World, Danon takes readers behind the scenes and onto the front lines of his UN tenure. He covers his successes and disappointments from the UN General Assembly to the back rooms, as well as the spotlight of the UN Security Council. Danon also lays out a vision of Israel's future as a major player in the Middle East and how the relatively tiny nation can contribute to global peace and prosperity.
Well, former Israeli UN Ambassador Danny Danon joins us now from Jerusalem. So welcome to the 700 Club, Ambassador.
Thank you for having me, Gordon.
Explain to our viewers why Israel bears the brunt of most UN resolutions.
Unfortunately, in the UN, instead of dealing with the real atrocities all around the world, they focus on Israel. I think it's pure anti-Semitism, and I tried in my book, In the Lion's Den, to explain where it's coming from. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, but I'm optimistic by nature, Gordon, and I was able in the UN to build bridges, to create partnerships, and to overcome those challenges. Hate will be there, but we can also bring hope by building bridges. Take, for example, the agreements we signed with the Gulf countries in the Abraham Accords. So things are possible also for Israel.
Well, during your time there, you also had an ally in this bridge building. It was former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, who also wrote the foreword to your new book. How much was that a help, and how much did that change the game, if you will, when she arrived at the UN in 2017?
Ambassador Haley is a great friend of Israel, and we are grateful for her support and love for the people of Israel. But look at the timing. She came immediately after President Obama pushed forward a resolution condemning Israel. And I want to remind you, Gordon, that in that resolution that came on December 2016, Resolution 2334, it actually called our presence in the old city of Jerusalem a flagrant violation of international law. That was a very hard moment for me to be there in the Security Council by myself, fighting not the Palestinians, not the EU, but actually the US who was pushing that resolution. So Ambassador Haley came immediately after that, and together with President Trump, they changed a lot at the UN. We are grateful for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for pulling out from the Iran deal, a recognition of the Golan Heights, and many more great initiatives. We worked on them together.
I vividly remember that resolution and remember thinking, how in the world could the U.S. do this? And then, just a few months later, Israel celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, where in the Jewish quarter, you could actually now have Jews again.
Coming up, more with Ambassador Danon about how people can stand in the gap for Israel and the Jewish people for such a time as this. Here's more of Gordon Robertson's interview with Ambassador Danny Danon and his book, In the Lion's Den, Israel and the World.
You say in your book that the foundation for a successful foreign policy is a victory mindset. What do you mean by that? And then how do you get to that?
Well, we have to realize that we have allies, we have friends, but we have to count only on ourselves. That's the story of the Bible. And it's still the story of our modern state of Israel today. We have a strong military, and we are capable of defending ourselves. One of the lessons I learned at the UN, when Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, who survived the Holocaust, he always told me, Danny, listen more carefully to the threats of your enemies than to the promises of your allies. And that's exactly what I did. And we should continue with that. We should look at what's happening today in Tehran with the nuclear agreement, and to realize that we have to be strong to protect ourselves.
Well, that threat of a nuclear Iran is hanging over the Middle East right now. How serious is that threat, and what can be done to stop it?
It's a real threat, not only for us, also to our allies in the region, the Gulf countries. They are worried about the radical ideas coming from Tehran. And I cannot understand why the administration in Washington is actually running to sign another agreement with Iran while they know that they are lying all the way. I hope there will be no agreement and that the US will stand with Israel. It is a threat for the stability of the region, and also it will allow Iran to send hundreds of millions of dollars to their proxies who promote terrorism in the region. And we are facing a wave of terrorism in the last few weeks here in Israel, Gordon.
I know the axe murders, it's incredible that it's still going on. There's still this incitement coming out of the Palestinian Authority, out of Hamas. At the same time, there's hope. And you recently took a delegation of diplomats and ambassadors, the Abraham Accords. You took them to the UAE, Bahrain, Israel. What did they learn?
It was an amazing delegation. I hope one day you will be able to join us. And actually, you know, people usually speak about the Middle East when there is tension or problems. But the delegates who came with me to the region, they saw prosperity, cooperation, and actually that we can use the cooperation to support other developing countries around the world. So I'm excited. There's a lot of excitement about the peace treaties, about the Abraham Accords, and I hope that we will have more countries like Saudi Arabia that will join the peace agreements and we can bring more stability to the region.
Well, Ambassador, one of the things I love about your book, In the Lion's Den, is you not only lay out a vision for Israel's future, you also tell and frankly teach supporters of Israel how to do this, how to support Israel during these turbulent times. Can you give us a brief glimpse at what's the best thing for supporters of Israel to do?
Well, the main message for me is not to sit idly by, not to be quiet. You know, you can be a student and you can hear the professor teaching hate or spreading lies. You can choose to ignore it. And my lesson is not to ignore anything. When I saw anti-Semitism, I fought back. I stood against it. That's my lesson for the new generation. And I think that's the way to prevail, is not to be quiet. Sometimes it's people think that it's easier just to move on. It's a mistake. It will come back to you. And I think, you know, when I tell all those stories behind the scene at the UN, how I dealt with leaders, with the EU, with Erdogan from Turkey, with the Iranians, I think it's interesting not only for the future diplomats, but for anyone who wants to be an activist.
Well, I love the book. I encourage everyone to get it. If you're a supporter of Israel, this will help you. It will help you not only stand up to anti-Semitism, stand up to BDS, it will also help you declare the good things that are coming out of Israel today. So it's called In the Lion's Den, Israel and the World. It's available wherever books are sold. And Ambassador Danon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
Up next, praying for the peace of Jerusalem, how the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast became a worldwide movement. The Bible commands us in Psalm 122, verse 6, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. In our studio, I talked with Albert Wexler, the director of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, who is bringing that biblical exhortation to the nations. Albert Wexler, thanks for joining us here on Jerusalem Dateline. You're the director of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. For those people that may not know it, what is the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast?
Thank you, Chris, for having me. Well, Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, as you well know, because you were there at the very beginning, is a movement to basically mobilize the church to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Because the Bible says so clearly that those who love Jerusalem and pray for the peace of Jerusalem will prosper. And we've seen it happen all over the world. When we began, it was by the endorsement of President Reuven Rivlin, the initiative that I gave to Robert Ilatov, that he carried on through the whole Knesset, talking to all the Knesset members, basically brought us on the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem to the Knesset, to the president's residence, to mobilize the church, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And then we, for our great surprise, were kind of taken all over the world.
Yeah.
So we've had now 15 breakfasts outside of Jerusalem.
Yeah. So it started in 2017 on the 50th anniversary. Where have you gone since then?
Well, it's been interesting to see how God has taken us, because as the calling to pray went out from the Knesset, it had to be also answered by the politicians, Christian politicians worldwide. So it was the First Lady of Uganda, or Senator Erika Betts from Australia, or Epobranch, the Dutch politician, who brought us to all of these different parliaments. And so this year had great events in Tallinn, in the very parliament building of Estonia, and just recently in Dallas, Texas, hosted by Senator Ted Cruz and Governor Abbott.
Two questions, Albert. Why is it so important to be now standing with Israel for this particular time in its history, and what do you have coming up here in Jerusalem?
There is always a need to stand with Israel because there's a calling for the church to stand as watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem. There is a calling to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and there is a calling to stand up for the seed of Abraham. Why? Because there is also constant attack and constant attempts to destroy the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and that's why I believe that it is God-given calling for the church and for individual believers to stand up and stand in the gap for Jerusalem, for God's purposes in this time.
So, final question, what can people do? How can people join the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast? You have one coming up, I believe, June 1 and 2 here in Jerusalem. If they're local, how can they join? And if they're around the world, what can they do?
People can still pack their bags, get their passports, and come. Israel is open. And so you can join us in the Knesset and here in Jerusalem as we will gather. But also online option is available, so people can go to our website and find us on the internet. It's easy to Google today Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast and just register at the online attendance option and join us, because it's going to be exciting.
Well, if you can, please join the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast online or even here in Jerusalem in person. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.